여러분 안녕하십니까? 2021 제주포럼 평화개발 아젠다의 새로운 방향성 세션의 사회를 맡은 아나운서 최송입니다. 반갑습니다. 지금부터 평화개발 아젠다의 새로운 방향성.
From now on, we will begin this session of Toward a New Strategy for Peace and Development. I will introduce moderator for today's session, Lee Shin-hwa, Professor of Korea University. Professor, please.
Good morning and good evening. This is Shin-hwa Lee. I'm Professor of Korea University and President of Korean Academic Council on United System. Today's session is talk about towards a new strategy for peace and development. As we all know, peace and development is two sides of the same coin. With the announcement of the UN SDG 16, the nexus between peace and development is getting more attention in international community. In particular, there's a interesting direction is getting highlighted, particularly after the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was highlighting the importance of peace and development, particularly the peace building and sustainable development. And in Korea as well, we are talking about HDP. There is a triple nexus: humanitarian assistance and development and peace nexus. It's getting also very important in the third master plan for the international development cooperation. In this context, it is my pleasure as a person who served as a UN Secretary General's advisor for the Peacebuilding Fund. I would like to congratulate the President Kim Jonghyun, who is the President of Korean Association of International Development and Cooperation. So he will give us a brief welcoming and opening remark. President Kim.
Good morning, everyone. I am Sung-gyu Kim, President of KAIDEC. KAIDEC hosted this session with KOICA. As you know, KAIDEC hosted two sessions in Jejuporom 2021. Yesterday, we had a wonderful session, theme of promotion of more inclusive development cooperation for the post-COVID-19 era. And today, a session with a theme of toward a new strategy for peace and development will be held. First of all, we would like to thank to our partner KOICA and especially President Hyuk Sang-son, who was president of KAIDEC. KOICA and KAIDEC has been collaborating for a long time and has been hosting joint session for the Jeju Forum since many years ago. We are very appreciated to host such a meaningful session today. The linkage or nexus between peace and development cooperation has been emphasized as an important methodology in the development cooperation landscape. Since particular in the corona pandemic era, the triple nexus of humanitarian aid, development cooperation, and peace is being emphasized more. And implementation measures and action plan in detail are being considered. Currently, KAIDEC is carrying out a cooperation project related to peace ODA with the local government in Korea and Asian Pacific countries. For example, the HDP Nexus Committee was launched with the UCLG aspect of Asia Pacific countries, and by DMZ Forum in this year, the HDP Nexus Commission declaration was adopted. Now we make a capacity building and knowledge sharing program with a local partner in Korea and our partner countries. After that, we will participate in a pilot project formation process in terms of peace ODA. I hope that today's session will contribute to the agenda setting related in new methodology and direction for post-COVID-19 era. Thank you again to KOICA and Jejuporom for sponsoring this session. Also many experts and participating in this session. I'd like special thanks to chairperson of this session, Professor Shinhwa Lee of Korea University, as well as the speakers and panelists. I'd like also thanks members of KAIDEC and experts in the field of development, NGO, civil society who are attending by online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Kim. Since we are talking about this session in new strategy for peace and development, the session have two Korean experts and one expert from Canada who's going to examine the direction of peace and development agenda presented by both by Korea and the Canada and discuss the ways to improve that. So in that session, without a further ado, I would like to introduce the Dr. Marshall Conley, who is from Conley International Education Association, who's going to talking about very important topic about the connection between government and civil society to improve the agenda for peace and development. Dr. Conley, are you here with
I
us?
am.
Hi, how are you? Welcome and good evening. So let me just give you 14 minutes initially so that we can have a discussion later on as well. Is it okay? Dr. Conley, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. You have a 14 minute in the beginning. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Please go
Okay.
ahead.
All right, let me start by suggesting to you one of the most famous quotes in my career, because I was heavily involved with UNESCO for some period of time, about 10 years, I think, in total. And this comes from the UNESCO Constitution. Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. This is the 16th forum, I understand, so we've accomplished a lot over those numbers of years. And although much of the world's focus is on the impact of COVID-19, and we're just getting out of it here in Canada, on the east coast of Canada. I was fortunate yesterday, in fact, to have my second vaccination, but we're still partially shut down in many parts of the country. In spite of the impact, we are facing continuing threats to peace in many regions of the world. This may be in some way related to COVID, but I think it's also connected to other things, even perhaps more importantly, such as the decline of democracy, the challenges of sustainability, the slowing of development, and the increase of human rights violations worldwide. In the past several years, out of both an academic reassessment and government repositioning, a new emphasis has been placed upon the mutual interrelationships among human rights, on the one part, economic development and democracy, as well as practical problems of promoting sustainability in all three of these areas. But the questions now I think are on both the theoretical and practical agendas seem really decidedly basic. What are the development avenues for democracy? Can there be effective international dialogues to promote the process of democratization? How deep are the cultural roots of respect for human rights and adherence to democratic institutions? And how can one ensure that shallow roots are implanted more deeply over time? Are there linkages that we can see or that we should be able to locate, which should be established between developmental institutions and human rights democratic development organizations? And fifthly, to what extent can international influence and leverage be used to force the pace of progress towards internationally accepted human rights norms? From the practical perspective, that of governments and aid organizations that are really at this stage confronting donor fatigue on one hand and recipient frustrations on the other, the questions on the current policy agenda become relatively succinct. What works and how do we help it work? And that's a fundamental question that we are facing with the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, I would like to just spend a little bit of time on a couple of other things before I give you some examples from Canada. There are common factors which promote respect for human rights, economic development, and democratic institutions. How the international community can promote the successful evolution of these factors seems remote from a practical policy perspective. So we have the academic perspective, we have lots of talk from government and NGOs, but we still have a challenge here. The movement in favor of human rights, democracy, and development appears to be both irresistible and irreversible from many of our perspectives. It's widely lauded in theory and supported in practice. However, past experience, I think, suggests that these trends are fragile and that there's ample scope for regression with or without international assistance in sustaining current trends. One only has to look at the fragile country index of 2021 to see how fragile the world has become. I have written an essay as well, which is available on the Jeju forum, where I further elaborate many of these issues, so I can't take much time now. What does achieving a sustainable peace really mean? And I think this is fundamental for us. Democracy, human rights, development are some elements, but there are obviously additional factors that I think that we need to be considering, such as the environmental factors. And here I'll mention only a few: impact of mining, the fishing, deforestation, climate change. In the case of economic factors, individual per capita income, gross national product, amount of debt of individuals and states, which certainly has increased substantially during the pandemic. Another factor is freedom to participate in all aspects of society. That means voting, voting rights, extending voter opportunities, gender equality, indigenous rights, the right to protest peacefully, a media with little censorship, and the list goes on. You can look at those that I've just talked about and see that, of course, many of those factors are problematic at this moment. So I go on some extended commentary in the paper that I presented as well, to talk about how we need to develop ways to transform conflict. But I just want to make that point that we must seek to alter the various characteristics and manifestations of conflict by addressing the root causes of a particular conflict over a long time and over the long term. We need to transform negative, destructive conflict into positive, constructive conflict and deal with structural, behavioral, and attitudinal aspects of conflict. So that is some of the theoretical perspective that I think that we have to consider in this forum. Let me just identify very briefly in the remaining time that I have some of the Canadian approaches. One which is very interesting that hasn't gone, unfortunately, very far, and that is the approach is what's called the Canadian Peace Initiative. The plan on this would be to create a department or a ministry of peace within the Canadian national government. It's part of a global movement with citizens from 51 countries participating. So far, only 5 countries have created such ministries, and unfortunately Canada is not one of them, in spite of the movement starting here. So we have a long way to go in terms of trying to create a flagship ministry that would promote peace and development and sustainability. So under the Sustainable Development Goals of 16 that Canada's promoted, I'll just mention a few. Support for the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development. Why is this important? Because it sets international standards. Canada was instrumental in creating the Kimberley process in terms of black market diamonds or conflict diamonds. And this is just a natural extension of seeing what we can do to create an intergovernmental forum that can set certain standards. Another is Together for Learning, and this is a program that Canada has introduced, education for refugees and other forcibly displaced and host community children and youth. A third that I only briefly can mention, and that is the whole international assistance program of the Government of Canada, and it includes gender equality, specifically as a program, empowerment of women and girls, human dignity through promotion of human rights, environment and climate action, and active support for international organizations. Canada was at the beginning of the creation of the United Nations. It was at the beginning of the creation of UNESCO, and has faithfully continued to participate in a positive manner. The challenge, I think, on these are many of these initiatives are exceptionally laudable. However, as in the case of many such efforts, the challenge is to operationalize joint declarations, operationalize programs, and operational grants in a meaningful manner. That's a major challenge. I'll come back to that in my concluding remarks. Just 2 other programs that I would mention to you is the Peace and Stabilizations program, which is part of international or global international, which is the Foreign Affairs Department now of Canada. It supports conflict prevention, dialogue, mediation, stabilization, peace building, and post-conflict recovery in fragile and conflict affected states. It provides quick and flexible funding, and this is the key on this. It's a quick action, short action programs where funding can be provided for peace initiatives usually through grants and contributions. So it's not a long drawn out process. 2 others that I would mention, the ELSI Initiative, which Korean government has worked with the Canadian government in assisting in a variety of ways on this initiative. It's the innovative multilateral pilot project that is developing and testing a combination of approaches to help overcome barriers and really increase the meaning participation of uniformed women in peace operations around the world, and with a focus particularly on police and military roles. At the moment, Canada is supporting training partnerships and technical assistance with the Ghana Armed Forces, the Zambia Police Service, and is supporting Senegal to implement its armed forces integration strategy. So and those countries are obviously heavily involved in peace operations in Africa. Finally, I have the list in the paper that I presented, but there are many Canadian NGOs, universities, and colleges who are engaged in promoting peace and development, sustainability through a variety of courses and programs. There's a takeaway, I think, on this. Firstly, after 76 years since its founding, the United Nations is dealing with more conflict than ever before. Where is the peace and development we so firmly believed in when the Charter was written? We have to ask ourselves that. Perhaps part of the answer lies in that opening statement that I made, reading from the UNESCO Constitution written in 1945. Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So we have much to do and a great long way to go. So there are many of us online and in the forum who believe that this statement, one only has to look at the latest conflict indexes to see we have a way to travel before this becomes reality. This does not mean we need to give up hope. It means that we must redouble our efforts to find lasting peace and meaningful development. In some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has taught us to be more caring of others. Perhaps that can be the major lesson learned from this catastrophe, that we have to be more caring for our fellow citizens. So I thank you. I'm sorry that there's not more that I could talk about in this short period of time. But one final comment would be, we have all these programs, but we're not doing an operationalization of those programs, which I consider to be as good as they could be or as effective as they could be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Conley. We are fully aware of the Canada's efforts of human security and peacekeeping championships. Well, and on that connection, when I was working for UN Secretary General's office on peace building, they said human rights and democracy is very important for development, particularly because the more than 2/3 of the the civil conflict is driven from old one rather than it create itself. So in that connection, I think you're highlighting for human rights and democracy and development nexus are very well taken. Thank you so much. And next, we will have Professor Guan from Seoul Cyber University. He's going to having also very important topics on how ODA is contributing to peace and development. And I believe that you will talk about in the case of the Korea. You have 14 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for kind instruction. The title that I make a presentation today is a revisit to Korea's ODA for peace and development. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, some expectation of the prosperous and peaceful world driven by the liberal capitalism was completely reversed by the increase of civil war and internationalized intrastate armed conflicts such as Somalia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Yemen, and Syria at the moment. The tendency to relapse to the violent conflict has been found due to incomplete stabilization and reconstruction. And particularly, we have to focus on some liberal peace building and state building that what the Western and external actor had dominated. So what Collier and somebody have called the conflict trap, the once a country experienced one civil war it is more likely to experience additional episodes of violence. So as the graph shows, the number of onset in a country with a previous conflict had been twice as many as country with no previous conflict since 1980s. This gap became much wider in 2000. There's no any single cause of armed conflict, but significantly addressed that unresolved and structural grievance would be the causing factor in poverty-stricken countries under totalitarian political oppression and injustice. The another tendency on armed conflict has been witnessed in the world's poorest and weakest state, ghettoized in the sub-Saharan Africa, which may lead to a discourse on underdevelopment and violent conflict. Therefore, we cannot but acknowledge that the peace, development, and security are closely intertwined, namely sleeping with enemies or dancing with enemies. So if securitization theory is applied to security and development nexus, it may conceive of conflicted, at the least developed countries as intersubjective establishment of existential threat to the West, in particular terrorist groups' violent provocation. Then donor countries in the West channel more aid to the countries with the fragility in the name of state building, peace building, democratization, even human rights, and it recurred the debates on securitization of aid. Separate from this debate, United Nations echoed peace in their development agenda in process of devising Millennium Development Goals. Although Millennium Declaration in 2000 stressed the interdependence between peace and development, there was no relevant goal in MDGs. So as a result, least developed countries with the fragility showed deterioration of socioeconomic growth during the period of MDGs from 2000 to 2015. Reflected shortcoming of MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, define peace one of its 5 pillars, and include peace in the goal 16, as Dr. Conley mentioned. Furthermore, Mr. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, declared the peace building and sustaining peace agenda on the ground. The UN development agencies should make every effort to prevent conflict so that vicious cycle of conflicts may be terminated. With the notion in mind, the question arises as to how Korean ODA has contributed to consolidate peace in partner countries. Because Dr. Conley already touched on some theoretical background of the peace and development, let me skip some slide. So just let me draw your attention on from 90s. The transition from state-centered security and development discourse into human development and human security agenda was raised in 1980s. So it stated that underdevelopment is the absence of peace. Since the agenda for peace was proclaimed in 1992 in the United Nations, peace building and international aid was asked to go in tandem, ranging from governance and institution building to socio-economic recovery and development. So development and security nexus already being interfaced in the security and development domain. The tendency was suddenly shifted to notion that development should back up security when 9/11 terrorist attack hit US and its allies. The evidence showed that US NGOs and some United Nations humanitarian agencies were financed and mobilized by the US administration when the war plan against Iraq, namely Phase 4 and Phase 5, was made in National Security Council and Central Command of the US Armed Forces. Later on, foreign aid was partly securitized in many aspects, so the security threat in countries with fragility should be contained or at least managed by international aid. So there are 2 arguments to West to pursue security-based stabilization, well-functioning state building. The less country, the conflicted country should be harbor of terrorist groups. So Robert Jelic, the president of World Bank Group, manifested river state building should be institutionalized in 2009. However, the peace scholars argued the human-centered and contextualized peace building had been neglected. because liberal state building prevented conflict country from initiating endogenous, more internalized peace building, which was vulnerable to relapse to the conflict. As a result, efforts to reconcile between endogenous peace building and liberal state building was made when the New Deal for engagement in fragile state was adopted in the Busan High-Level Forum in 2011. So UN Peace Agenda currently prevention, mediation, and peace building to UN development agencies with which peace apparatus actually engaged. Also, peace operation should be tuned to achieve SDGs by action for peace agenda, peace operation. So peace building more focus on to prevent violent conflict with mobilization, sufficient resources pledged by traditional donors and non-traditional donors. The hard agenda of disarmament to echo new report of securing our common future for disarmament. So still debate is going on. The liberal approach to the peace building is still mainstreamed, while inclusive, more participatory initiatives are also applied in the field. Though a lot of efforts and resources are supported, it usually takes a long time to achieve visible and substantial outcome. So related to previous debates, protracted and low visibility of outcome of donors, outcomes forbid donors from committing long-term engagement of the peace building. So let me turn to our Korea's policy and strategy on peace and development. When it comes to Korea's aid for peace and development, the Framework Act on International Development Cooperation actually indicate the purpose of international development cooperation contributed to co-prosperity of humanity and to world peace. According to the framework law, Korean government makes the basic plan for international development cooperation every 5 years. So the third basic plan in 2021 to 2025 defines the 4 strategic goals, one of which is inclusive ODA. So each program is expanding humanitarian assistance, which includes consolidating HDP nexus by devising its strategy and placing more ODA in host state of UN peace operations and increasing support to countries with priority. Secondly, in prosperous ODA, Korea will concentrate on building social infrastructure, resolving social inequality by support to education, health, social safety net for underprivileged, which aims to resolve grievance preemptively. To back up the third basic plan, Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently released the implementing strategy of HDP Nexus, such as adapting approach to prevent crisis and conflict in overall ODA, and strengthening multi-party collaboration, including diplomatic, development, possibly defense. Increasing funding scheme aligned HDP Nexus, ensuring ODA strategy, considering foreign policy and more tailored to field context. Finally, participating in global initiative in conjunction with HDP Nexus and improving the implementation system to synergy HDP Nexus. In implementing agency of Korean government, is KOICA also in process of making aid strategy for peace and governance in 2011 to 2021 to 2030. The goal of the Peace ODA is to prevent violent conflict and ensure foundation of peaceful life in partner countries. But in reality, as graph showed, according to the CRS data, member state OECD DOC member countries commit approximately 2% of their ODA for the area of conflict, peace, and security. However, in case of Korea, though ODA volume has been steadfastly increasing, its commitment to conflict, peace, and security is generally much lower than average commitment of other donor countries. So let me touch on some new initiative of Korean government. It's a Mindfree peace community in the Mekong region, which is the new flagship program to ensure Mindfree peace community in sub-region of the Mekong. Since Second Indochina War was over, its legacy was widespread contamination of explosive remnant war, we call ELW, for example, landmines, unexploded ordnance, cluster munition in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam. Actually, Laos government declared that 18 provinces, all provinces contaminated by UXO and cluster munition, more than 35% of total land. And Vietnam has 15 provinces heavily contaminated by landmines in central region. Mine and UXO victims of 3 countries amounted to more than 200,000 people, and even now, people in the region exposed to threat of explosive remnants of war. The mine action is closely interrelated with SDG on the ground. The land released by mine clearance can be explored for farming, housing, or other economic development, which is led to achieve SDG 1, 2, 3, and 4. The victim assistance, such as rehabilitation, training for income generation, accessibility to inclusive social services, ensure SDG 7, 8, and 9 goals. But ironically, Korea is one of the countries with a heavily contaminated minefield in DMZ and rear anti-air defense areas. In that regard, President Moon Jae-in stressed that DMZ will be renamed as a mine-free international peace zone, collaborating with UN Mine Action Services and International Peacebuilding Organization in 74th session of UN General Assembly in September 2019. In the same year, first Mekong and Korea summit took place, and Korean government pledged its commitment to Korea-Mekong Future Peace Community Program by 2030. Mine-free peace community program reflects HDP nexus on the ground, the victim assistance to ameliorate their suffering and to protect the victim's dignity and rights entails humanitarian assistance. Secondly, inclusive agricultural exploration of the released land resort to development cooperation. And finally, humanitarian demining to clear explosive ordnance will remove negative legacy of armed conflict, ultimately lead to peace consolidation and inner peace in each individuals who used to be threatened by landmines. So the program strategy addressed the first, the free from threat of mines and UXO. The second, victims' right protected and transform into land of peace and prosperity in the Mekong, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam countries. As you see this diagram, since the program was officially adopted in 2019, humanitarian demining, victim assistance, and sustainable rural development projects have been earmarked and implemented in 4 countries, which amounts to more than $101 million. It should be noted that Korean government would be the first donor country that attempts to integrate each component of mine action and plus to rural development to achieve a more substantial outcome. Of course, the outcome has yet been found, and it will definitely take a certain time to get evidence. But it is expected that comparative advantages of integrated management will contribute to fill the missing gap among each different project component. In our conclusion, peace and development is no longer mutually exclusive, but rather closely intertwined and interrelated and mutually inclusive. So ODA should be dispersed not only to mitigate the structure and prolonged grievance in a preemptive manner, but to address conflict transformation beyond conflict management and resolution. In theory, everybody believes that multiple partnership and coordination will work, but no organization wants to be coordinated. Actually, Dr. Lee highlight some coordination and cooperation between Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense, but it's still staggering because nobody wants to be coordinated and collaborative. So how to overcome the dilemma would be the precondition to formalize partnership and coordination. Finally, the Korean government should have some long-term plan and pledge resources to cultivate civilian peace builders who will play a key role in conflict transformation and promoting indigenous peace building in conflict societies where Korean government supports. Actually, I invited Dr. Masu and colleague to Korea in 2018 to conduct some peace building training programs supported by KAIDEC and KOICA, but it's just a one-time event. It couldn't continue to be as the program for the capacity building of civilian peace building. So thank you for listening and attention.
Thank you, Professor Guan. In the beginning, he also highlighting importance of how to prevent conflict from relapsing. And for that, he was also talking about development and peace and security nexus is very important. And also, I think it's very important, particularly Korea is also facing with the problem of the mining in demilitarized zone. And so in that connection, probably those mine-free peace community in the Mekong region is a very good initiatives of a Korean government, which is also related to regional partnership that United Nations are highlighting it. Our final presenter is Professor Jeon Park. She's also talking about importance of aid, I believe, but probably she will give us a little bit of the different perspectives, saying that does aid bring peace in conflict-ridden countries? So you have less than 40 minutes. Is it okay?
Yes, sure. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lee. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeon Park from Jeonbuk National University. Okay, thank you for having me here, this wonderful stage to share my research. As you can see here, my topic for today, does aid bring peace in conflict-related countries? Especially, I would like to focus on the African countries for this presentation. These are contents for today: introduction, literatures, research, design, analysis, and conclusions with some implications. Okay, let's begin with the introduction here. The international community has provided relatively high proportions of aid to conflict-related countries in Africa. Actually, I have some numbers to prove this sentence. Like more than 65% of all aid toward Africa, that's for the conflict-related zones. And also we have the number, like year 2002, we have $18 billion transferred to this area. However, we have much bigger number here in 2019. That was $46 billion US dollars in 2019. It means like a 2.5 times bigger number of aid volume we have for this area. Then it brings a kind of question that why we transfer a huge amount of resources for this area. I'm sure that there has been a lot of documents. It says it's for the peace and prosperity in this area. It means they try to stop the conflict in this region. However, I would like to find a real situation whether does foreign aid contribute to the civil war termination or not. Especially, are there any particular types of aid that can shorten or extend the duration of civil war? I try to attempt to answer these questions by analyzing how different types of foreign aid affect the duration of African civil conflict for this presentation. Okay, let's explain. Let me explain brief literatures about these previous studies. A number of literatures have been negatively evaluating the effects of aid on conflict rather than positively. I'm going to explain some literatures here. For example, we have the research from Esman and Herring, year 2000. You might check the references from the end of this presentation document. Actually, we have the research from Esman and Herring, year 2000, and he mentioned that the aid might be a matter of resource for all population of population of the recipient countries. Therefore, it could be easily related to conflict under any kind of circumstances. Especially, we can see that the resource from the aid would affect the relationship between the government and level. It might bring the conflict between them. According to the Andrew and Beth year 2017, when there are very strong assistance from the aid agency toward the government, it seems like a very serious attack from the level in that spot. We might have the question about that story, that why there are very serious conflict in that region if there are very huge amount of aid toward that population in that country. We can think like this way. When the aid agency, they transfer big money to one spot, it seems like for the leader of level, and he think like if there become like a huge amount of money, and that brings like a fancy buildings, like a fancy elementary school, fancy hospitals, and that might bring more people to believe the government, not the level. So the leader of level, he afraid of that kind of situation. That's why they try to seriously attack that spot. So I would like to summarize that the previous literature, that even the aid cannot bring any kind of peace, and sometimes that affect to the very serious conflict between any kind of ordinary people even. So I think that this is really valuable question. We need to check the really money bring peace or not. And the previous literatures, they only think about all the resources from aid is a kind of sum of the transferred resources only. So I would like to focus on the type, especially what kind of type of aid that can affect to the peace and prosperity in the conflict-related zone in African countries. So it seems like a not very different research question, but I'm sure that I have very different viewpoint to look at this kind of stories here. Okay, and one more stories I would like to introduce as a researchers here. I need to assume some kind of the things, like we assume that when the balance between the government and the level is broken, there is the end of civil conflict. We might think like a different way to termination of the civil war. However, in this presentation, I would like to assume that when they have the balance of resources between the level and the government, and it seems like a conflict because they compete each other. That's the kind of civil conflict. However, when they have the unbalanced resources between two groups, then maybe it's the end of civil conflict. So this reflects that the number of previous studies point the balance of resources between the government and level as a key determinant of the continuation and termination of the civil conflict. Here we can look at what type of aid have a significant effect on the breaking of the balance. So our research question, as you can see here, like a step-by-step, like a different type of aid would differently affect to the duration of conflict. A type of aid which could significantly affect to the breaking the balance of resources between the level and the government would potentially bring the early termination of conflict. Therefore, as you can see here, this might be my real research question, that which type of aid would significantly affect to the early termination of conflict. Very simple and very clear, I hope. Then let me move to the research design here. I took the 51 conflict cases in 34 African countries during the period from year 2000 to 2009. I want to emphasize that why I choose this period. That's because of the data. Actually, I got the aid data from OECD CLS, and they offer only this period, like a year 2000 to right now. So there's like no way to take another period, so I took this period. As you can see here, the variables for the independent variables here, the budget support, food program, project aid, technical assistance, debt relief, and etc. These are all from OECD CLS. So I just adopt all the type of aid from OECD CLS here. And one more things I want to emphasize here, I would like to bring the volume of aid as an independent variable. Also, I want to try to think about the aid shock. From the previous literature, there are a kind of argument that it's not only a matter about the volume of aid, it's the matter of the changing of the volume of aid in that recipient country that can bring another kind of like impact on any kind of like a sector. So I would like to think about aid shock. So I take the independent variable from OECD CLS, and I also check that it's increasing or decreasing compared to the previous year. So I have two models to prove my research question. One is about the volume only, and second part is about the aid shock. And you can see here I have several, some control variables here. Political institutions, external intervention, territorial conflict, population, GDP per capita, economic growth rates, and etc. Why I took these control variables? Of course, these are based on the previous literatures, and also we need to think about when there are more serious civil conflict. That might be because of these kind of control variable matters. So I invite these control variables for my research. And here, finally, I got the analysis for finding here. As I said you before, I have two kind of versions to prove my hypothesis. One is about the aid volume, and the other is about the aid shock. And as you can see, I hope you can see the clearly the name of the variable, I guess. And as I said, I invite the 8 types. So there are like 7 types of aid, and it seems like nothing affect to the peace in African countries. But budget support, it seems like it affect to the termination of the civil conflict in African countries. It's very clear. And the other like a program, project, and technical assistance, these are not affect to the termination of civil conflict in African country. And second result, you can see that there seems like only one independent variables. It affects to the termination of civil conflict. That's the budget support decreasing. So I would like to interpret these findings like this way. The first about the aid volume is you can see the things like only budget support that affect to the balance of resources between two groups, which means the government and level, they got the signal from the aid volume only when it comes to the type of budget support. Why? I might explain like this way. When the international agency, they offer the budget support, it means a kind of cash-based aid to the government. And the level can think about, wow, there are more money, real money, not the assistance or not the scholarship, things like that. It's the kind of they can really use, right? So they can got it's kind of the resource unbalance. So we can expect the end of civil conflict. And how we can explain about the result too, about the aid shock. I might explain that if there are huge decreasing of aid support in the type of budget area, then it feels like a very big shot for the government. And the level also realize that, wow, they might have a lot less money from the international community, and the level of the leader of level, he proud of that moment, and he tried to attack this kind of all the things, and then it's like the unbalance of the resources is go for the level. So it's like the level kinds of winning the civil war, something like that. So it's like we can think about how the balance of resources can be affected by aid volume and aid shock from this analysis. Okay, let me conclude my research here. Okay, we can see very clearly, except budget support, seems like nothing happens with the aid for the peace and prosperity in the African conflict areas. So it's very interesting finding, because as we all know that from the previous literatures, always international community, they care about the money for fragile states. because they worry about the governance matter, how they handle the money. So they worry about that's like a loose aid, like a failure of aiding things. However, as you can see from my result, the money, like a cash-based type of aid, which might be the budget support, that can affect to the real like a positive way to the conflict-related zone in African countries. So I would like to conclude with the lessons for South Korean aid policy here, the last sentence, that as you can see, like a project and training program, these are the main type of aid for the African countries from South Korean government. However, as you can see, it need to consider that we might focus on conflict-related area in African continent, which should be differently managed for the effective of aid giving, actually. So yeah, that's all things about my research. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, wonderful, Professor Park. Well, usually there are some debate in the context of how aid can contribute or deteriorate the development and conflict, right? And I think that kind of empirical data and implication for the government is very worthwhile to be noted. Thank you so much. We have 3 discussants and have 24 minutes left. So maybe I'll just give you 5 to 6 minutes for the discussion. Is it okay with you? The first, I would like to invite from online, the Dr. Sebastian Kasap. He's from Minds Advisory Group. So I would say good evening, right?
Very early morning.
Very early morning. Okay, sorry. You're from
4 a.m.
So shall we talk for 5 to 6 minutes in the beginning?
Sure.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss the presentation of Professor Conley. That was what I was asked to do. And first of all, I would like to congratulate that the conclusion that conflict transformation is at the core to bring this nexus into fruition. And I just unfortunately think that few people really understand what this conflict transformation is all about. And in your paper, Professor Conley, you explain it very well. But if I just hear something like positive, constructive conflict, I think many people will not really understand what that means. And I think it would be worthwhile to go deeper and really try to see what that means in practice. What I can see in our own NGO, for example, Minds Advisory Group, is that we are taking conflict sensitivity much more seriously today. And it has to go beyond a simple do no harm analysis about our own workings. It has to understand the context. And we are talking about gender for 25 years and more now, but it's more than gender analysis. It has to take into account also the diversity aspects, etc. So a good context analysis using tools like the power interest matrix really helps to be more sensitive how we do our works and how it has an impact or not in the country. This leads to another important point. We need better data often. So, for example, we work in the area of small arms and light weapons, gun violence, etc. But the data is really scarce to analyze the victims from gun violence, etc. And without good data, as we know, it's hard to plan on it. On the nexus, it definitely is a good approach, and I'm very happy that we are linking aid development to peace. But we know it's still fairly new, and the reality is not that strong yet to bring, especially that third element, peace, into the analysis. And especially, I think Professor Guan mentioned that it's the link more to security and securitization of aid and the stabilization discourse since 9/11, basically. Anyone can be termed a terrorist, and what used to be freedom fighters are terrorists, and so on. So, I mean, this discourse, I think, is crucial to analyze people and the reasons why they maybe opt for armed conflict as well. Let's look at Myanmar, for example. There are many good reasons, and just to term people as terrorists is not really helpful. therefore, what's the solution? I think to go towards conflict transformation, I think the human rights, as mentioned before, is really the cross-cutting agenda. And if we fully embrace human rights, that leads also to sustainability. So if we break it down by humanitarian aid, does everyone have access to humanitarian aid? So equal access. On development, where's the respect for human rights in many of these development models we're looking at these days in autocratic regimes across the world? If you look at economic development, there's so much unequal distribution of wealth. We can use the Gini coefficient to see the inequalities globally instead of just looking at GDP. And it's acknowledged that the GDP doesn't really reflect the economic situation in most parts of the world. And Professor Conley has, in his paper, and I think he said it also, is 1.6 billion people are working in the informal sector globally. This is not reflected in any of our indices. On the third aspect, the peace, who suffers most? It's civilians, women and children, persons with disability, the elderly, the entire youth. Syria is without education, most of them, I mean, up to 6 billion. If we look at democracy, I mean, that is a big topic. What democracy are we talking about? What democratic system is proving to work? And I think one of the ways how to measure this could be to look at the level, how inclusive the system is for all citizens. Talking about accountability, participation, and so on. So I think these aspects we need to look at, and that's what's good about the Canadian model, as was shown, to look at yourself, work on your own reality, and abroad. So linking this, I really laud it, and find it should be copied by more countries. Talking about democracy a little bit more, I think the topic of shrinking spaces I wanted to bring up. Explicit laws are forbidding civil society to work, not only in Russia. In many developing countries for the last 5-10 years have made it very hard to function, to accept any money from abroad. And so our workings as civil society are becoming more and more difficult. Many. The topic dignity came up, the victims, the dignity. I think that is really a core topic if we talk about human rights. And it goes beyond mere physical needs and safety needs, as important as they are, but people need dignity. And I've been working on the sector about informal housing as well. And I mean, it's just like the informal sector, people are building a value of houses that's unbelievable globally, and they are basically at the threat of being demolished, and eviction is across their head all the time. Where's their dignity? On peace, I think it has improved a lot, and I'm glad to hear that Professor Lee has been with the Peacebuilding Fund. And also the European Union is now working with mediators. There's an EU mediation support team, I think a few people realize. And I believe this should be better known and reflected on how can we prevent wars. And as it was said before, this prevent conflict from relapsing. That's really the topic, very, very good topic to address in more detail. Allow me to comment just on the Canadian initiatives. I was a bit surprised not to hear more about the human security concept. So I think that's a truly Canadian baby. And so I would like to hear more, where does that sit today, and how important is that model still, maybe in comparison to the stabilization efforts. R2P, I haven't heard that by anyone today. So the responsibility to protect, and the opposition in Myanmar, the civilian opposition, raised placards with the sign R2P. I'm not sure how many people understood that. Where is that concept? don't want to take up a lot of time. I think this Ministry of Peace is really interesting, and in Germany, where I come from, there were discussions about a future ministry, which is similar and tries to also bring in the aspect of the environment, climate change, other topics that are really relevant in today's debate. And maybe one example from the German context as well is the working through political party foundations, which I think is quite unique. And I think we use a percentage in Germany of the government budget to promote peace, development, etc. And we have a role to play in country and also international. And again, I think that linkage to be coherent is really relevant. Together for Learning, I just want to link it back to my work again. Canada is supporting NGOs for education and so on. That includes also the Minds Action Canada. So there's a youth leadership education action program, which is really interesting, successful to bring people from all over the world together and participate also in the IHL. Another aspect we haven't mentioned much tonight, the relevance of conventions, and like the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention with Ottawa, where it was started in 1997, is very strong for fostering human rights. Let me end at that. Maybe just the quote, I really liked it from the UNESCO, and I would just update it with a gender lens and say it's in the minds of women, girls, boys, and men that the defenses of peace must be.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm glad you just mentioned about R2P as well. But I will just quickly move on to Professor Kim Jonghyun, he's a professor of economics from Yonsei University. You also have 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Lee Singhwa. I'd like to thank 3 presenters. Dr. Conley pointed out that it is required to address the root causes of the conflict to transform it in the long run, and also introduce the Canadian peace initiatives and programs. Professor Guan introduced the discourses on peace and development and explained some progress of the ODA policies in Korea and presented some cases. Professor Park's research indicated that aid composition, aid mix is important factor in the determination of the conflict duration. Disaggregating the aid and then looking into the impact of the individual factors seems to be the major merit of this study. And then interesting, the result is that negative aid shock rather than positive shock contribute to the reduction of the conflict duration. The recorded arms conflict increased to highest number in almost 30 years recently, and then also conflicts are lasting longer. And then also the possibility of returning to the conflict is very high, as the Professor Guan's PPT slide indicate. And despite this growing conflict and humanitarian need, resources to respond to these challenges are under pressure, and humanitarian funding peaked recently and has been declining, and also development aid leveled off, and then in particular for the least developed nations. And conflict prevention is severely underfunded, even though it is considered as the most cost-effective approach to the sustaining peace. The concept of the sustaining peace emphasizes the critical importance of the conflict prevention. A state's experience of civil war not only damaged the economy during the conflict, but also reversed the future development, creating so-called conflict trap, as the Professor Guan introduced. And conflict further exacerbate and worsen these conditions that initially result in conflict. So these conditions include poverty and inequality and poor governance and ethnic tensions and so on, and making these countries more likely to relapse into the conflict. However, international efforts to engage in states at the risk of the conflicts remain limited, and conflict prevention remains seriously underfunded. From the perspective of ODA policy in Korea, this suggests that ODA composition needs to be adjusted toward the increasing the proportion of the conflict prevention ODA. In fact, recently OECD DAC expanded the ODA eligibility, including the preventive dimension as its component. The best way to prevent countries from descending into the conflict is to ensure that they are resilient through the investment in the inclusive and sustainable development. So the ODA policy in Korea needs to strengthen the support for the investment in this direction. Also, Professor Guan introduced the example of the HDP Nexus framework. So, in fact, sustaining peace call for the better linkage, the fundamental pillars of the peace and the development and humanitarian actions. And then this HDP Nexus asked the three actors to consider whether they could conduct more holistically to enable them to more effectively to prevent conflict. But still, it seems that there are some operational obstacles which have to be overcome. One thing is that there can be disparity between the concept of the nexus and actual implementation. So HDP Nexus is theoretically expected to bring together the policy framework across different sectors and promote the joint planning for the shared outcome. But when it comes to the reality of the implementing the Nexus, it is not easy to coordinate the actions jointly, as the different actors, they use different languages and different ways of working. So it is important to implement the engagement strategies in a more harmonized way, still utilizing the comparative advantage of the IT sector. Second is related with the funding mechanism. So existing funding mechanism for each sector needs to be adjusted to accommodate the HDP Nexus approach, because so typically humanitarian activities are planned on some annual basis, and development and peace programs are planned for the 1 to 5 years, and so it is required to prepare the multi-year time framework for financing operations of the HDP framework. And yeah, lastly, I agree with Dr. Connie that we need to redouble our effort to establish the lasting peace and meaningful development. And the collaborative effort for the shared analysis of root causes and of conflict and investment in the institution today for the sustaining peace will improve the resilience in the face of the crisis in the future. These are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, 6 minutes, right? 5 minutes.
Sorry about it. That's always the benefit or cost
I'm
of
watching
the
our
last
clock,
presenter,
and
right?
almost time
Thank
to
you.
finish our sessions. I'd like to focus on Professor Park's the paper on the conflict and peace, and also the budget support. Actually, yes, there are some kinds of bunch of existing literature, which is kinds of budget support sustain the conflict. That is the main belief. However, Professor Park's the research is kind of in the opposite the result, right? Budget support can terminate or can influence on terminations or kinds of termination of the certain conflict in African countries, to make this finding more concrete, because of, I said before, yes, there are kinds of the bunch of the research is that opposite argument, right? It sustained the conflict. However, she said different way. To make, in the sense, to make her argument more concrete, if she can conduct kinds of case studies, how actually this kind of budget support for the conflict countries finished certain level of conflict, yes, then I think your research can be more concrete. Second issue is that the problem, however, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned about South Korean government need to consider budget support in terms of peace and development aspect. However, our problem is that when we budget support is kind of effective. So the problem is which side we're going to support, when we will engage in. That kind of things might be the issue of the international politics. Also, Kashak said that, mentioned about the Myanmar cases and R2P issues. Yes, we are the international communities. We know there's some kinds of tools and methodologies to solve the problems. However, when we engage in, which side we support, who's going to decide? Where is the United Nations? I mentioned about R2P issues and some other conferences, and then some said the R2P is dead. Look, the Myanmar cases, they are very clear which side we have to support, and we have tools. As Professor Park said, the budget support can crack the resource balances, right? And then we can terminate some kinds of conflict. Yes, we have some kinds of tools and knowledges based upon these kinds of studies, but international community is doing nothing at the moment. Are we doing something? I'm not sure about. But problem is that once South Korean government adopt this kind of budget support for the termination of certain conflict, we have the main issues we need to concern is that, when and where and which side we're gonna, apply these methodologies. That is my comment on Professor Park. And a little comment about Professor Guan about South Korea's initiative and kinds of things. We actually, the Professor Park is Guan is a kind of pioneer, introducing these kinds of mine action program in South Korean ODA. I think it is quite successful. However, we need to develop more innovative and kind of inclusive project and program linking the peace and development and humanitarian assistance. Actually, yes, this kind of mine program in Korean already settled by Professor Kwon. I think it's quite successful. But anything else we can introduce, and we can proselytize our effort to international communities? I think that's going to be our challenges. We need more innovative and more inclusive project and program in this approach of HTP Nexus. I think that's going to be our challenges. And together, to create these kinds of innovative things, yes, I think the Marshall Conley's approaches, we need to consider democracy and human rights and gender and education issues in the aspect of the peace and development approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moon, for your concise and crispy remark, despite the time limit. President Conley, I think I will just give you some 2 minutes, if it's okay with you, so that other two Korean colleagues can have a 1 minute each.
Of course. Thank
you.
Thank you. And I apologize that we had an error of not projecting the full PowerPoint when I was speaking. That was my error of setting it up. There are a couple of things that came up. Sebastian mentioned the human security. Well, that underlies most of what I was talking about. And when we look at the human security, we're looking, in the case of Canada at the moment, refugee issues, empowering women, and also dealing with combating hate by promoting pluralism. We're not being particularly successful. We're trying nationally and internationally. If any of you are following currently the Canadian news, you'll know that yesterday we uncovered another number of graves of our indigenous children who were in the residential schools, which ran for almost 150 years in Canada. And these were yesterday's over 700 unmarked graves. This was a result of government policy, exploitation of our indigenous population. And the week before was 275 from a different residential school. And this is only in 2 weeks. So we will literally find thousands of unmarked graves. And this relates very badly in terms of domestic human security and discrimination issues, not only by previous governments, but also previous religious organizations, both Protestant and Catholic, who are involved in this. I think one of the important things that we have to think about for the future, and I can just stop at this, is that we are facing a major challenge on increased global migration, and not only refugee flows, but economic migrants and so on. That flow is absolutely incredible. If any of you have visited Europe prior to the pandemic, you have seen what has happened, and I've been peripherally involved with some of that, and to see it's just horrendous, the number of people coming onto the shores of Europe. The second is the one that we're living right now, which is the new diseases. And that's very much a question of human security. And how are we going to deal with that in a more integrated international way? It's taken a great deal of pressure on governments who were wealthy to share their vaccines. And that's only starting to now, and particularly because of the G7 meeting in Cornwall, England last week. There's a little better effort, but it's a long way to go. There'll still be millions of people who are going to die because of this COVID strain. And I am convinced that next year we will see even a worse strain. We're already seeing the so-called Delta strain. It's going to get worse, and we have to think of this in a holistic, global manner. And the last 2 points that I'd make is that we are living in an increasingly interconnected and competitive digital world, and we've seen what that means in terms of human security, from the hacking of pipelines to ransoms and so on. And all of this ultimately comes down to relating to climate change. So these are not simple solutions that we'll be able to come up with, but we have to be thinking about how we do this in an integrated and cooperative, collaborative manner. We can't continue to think that only one country can lead the way. This has got to be international cooperation, which throws it back to the previous comment about the United Nations, which is not working very successfully at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just got a pressure from the organizers to wrap it up the session. So I'm sorry not to be able to give time for 2 other presenters. But thank you so much. And I look forward to another opportunity to discuss this important project. And thank you for joining us through the hybrid forum. So I will close this session for now. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
네, 다시 한번 무대 위에 찾아.
Thank you very much, the moderator and speakers. Please give them a warm round of applause. We will take a short break, and next session will be hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the direction of science and technology diplomacy.